60 seconds. That's the window Israeli military officials say it took to kill 40 senior Iranian commanders in the opening moments of this war. Not over a night of strikes, not over the course of a campaign. 60 seconds in one coordinated wave, hitting several locations across Tehran at the exact same moment, catching a huge portion of Iran's most senior military and security leadership together in one place at one time. That is, without much exaggeration, one of the most devastating single strikes against a national leadership structure in modern military history, and it set the entire tone for everything that's followed in this war ever since. So let's actually walk through what happened, because the scale of this event deserves a real breakdown rather than just a headline number. We're going to go through exactly how this strike was carried out, who was actually in that room, and across those targeted sites when it happened, why this represents the second time in less than a year that Iran has lost its top military leadership to the exact same kind of operation, and what happens to a country's entire command structure when you remove that many senior officials from the board simultaneously. Then we'll get into the roundup and the strategic picture, because the aftershocks of that 60-second window have been shaping nearly every major development in this war ever since. If you're finding this kind of detailed breakdown useful, go ahead and hit subscribe, drop a like, and let me know in the comments what you think happens to a military when its entire senior leadership gets wiped out this fast, because the honest answer is more complicated than most people assume. Let's start with exactly what happened, because the details here matter enormously. In the early hours of Saturday, February the 28th, 2026, Israel launched a wide-ranging operation that would later be given the name Operation Roaring Lion, hitting Tehran and multiple provinces across Iran simultaneously. The stated goal, according to Israeli officials, was a preemptive strike specifically targeting what they described as the threat posed by Iran's own senior leadership. The opening wave hit several locations across the capital at once, and according to the Israeli military's own account, 7 members of Iran's top security leadership happened to be gathered together at one of those targeted sites when the strikes landed. That single detail, 7 of the most senior security officials in the entire country physically together in one place at the exact moment the strikes hit, is really the key that made this operation as devastating as it turned out to be. You don't need 40 separate strikes to eliminate 40 senior officials if a meaningful chunk of them are already standing in the same room. Iranian state media later confirmed that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself was killed at dawn that Saturday, targeted at his workplace inside the leadership compound in central Tehran. Iranian officials offered relatively few operational details about the circumstances, saying only that he had been in his office carrying out his official duties at the time. There was a strange period of hours immediately following the strike where Israeli sources and President Trump had already publicly stated Khamenei was dead, while Iranian state media remained completely silent, neither confirming nor denying it, which created a genuinely tense stretch of uncertainty before Tehran's own outlets eventually confirmed what had already been reported abroad. Iranian media also later reported that relatives connected to Khamenei's close family circle were killed in strikes on residences linked to the Supreme Leader, which tells you the targeting here wasn't limited strictly to official command posts. It extended into the personal and family infrastructure surrounding the country's most powerful figure. That gap between the initial claims and the official Iranian confirmation is itself worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how a government handles the earliest hours of a crisis this severe. When a country's own state broadcaster goes silent on the fate of its highest authority for hours, while foreign governments are already speaking about his death in the past tense, that silence isn't neutral. It's a signal of confusion and scrambling, happening somewhere behind the scenes. Officials trying to verify what happened, trying to figure out who's actually still alive and in a position to speak with any authority, and trying to work out how to manage the announcement of the single most consequential leadership loss in the modern history of the Islamic Republic without triggering immediate panic or total breakdown of public order. That kind of hesitation at the very top, even if it only lasted a matter of hours, previews exactly the kind of confusion and delayed decision-making that would go on to characterize much of Iran's broader response throughout the following months of this war. Alongside Khamenei, the list of who else was killed in that same opening window reads like a roll call of Iran's entire senior defense establishment. Major General Abdolrahim Mousavi, Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces, was killed in the strikes. Aziz Nasirzadeh, the country's defense minister, was killed alongside other top commanders during what's been described as a military meeting. Ali Khamenei, secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, and one of Khamenei's closest and most trusted advisors for decades, was killed as well. Mohammad Pakpour, the senior Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, who had led the organization's ground forces for 16 years before rising to its top post, was also among the dead. Beyond those headline names, the fuller list that's since been compiled includes the commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force, the head of the Intelligence Directorate at the Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, the head of the military office of the Supreme Leader, the chairman of Iran's organization overseeing defensive research and innovation, and his immediate predecessor in that same role, the chief of the General Staff of Iran's Armed Forces, the commander of Iran's Police Intelligence Organization, a senior intelligence ministry official, the deputy for logistics and support on the General Staff, the deputy head of the Office of the Supreme Leader, and the heads of both operations, planning, and logistics on the Armed Forces General Staff. That's not a partial list of casualties from a chaotic night of fighting. That's a nearly complete accounting of the entire senior tier of Iran's military, intelligence, and security bureaucracy, gone within the same narrow window of time. It's worth spending a moment on just how broad that list actually is across different functional areas of government, because it reveals something important about how comprehensive this strike really was. This wasn't purely a military decapitation aimed at generals and field commanders. It reached directly into Iran's intelligence services, its internal security and police apparatus, its nuclear and defense research establishment, and the personal staff surrounding the Supreme Leader himself. A purely military strike targeting only battlefield commanders would have left Iran's intelligence and internal security functions largely intact, still capable of gathering information and coordinating internal responses, even while the military chain of command scrambled to reorganize. Instead, this strike appears to have been deliberately designed to hit every major pillar of the regime's security architecture simultaneously: military command, intelligence gathering, internal policing, and the Supreme Leader's own inner circle, all at once, which is precisely why the resulting vacuum has proven so difficult for Iran to fill cleanly in the months since. Here's the detail that makes this whole story even more remarkable, and it's genuinely one of the more unusual patterns in recent military history. This wasn't the first time Iran lost its top military leadership to exactly this kind of strike. Mousavi, the chief of staff killed in this latest operation, had only been in that position because his predecessor, Mohammad Bagheri, was killed during Israel's earlier 12-day war back in June of 2025. Think about what that actually means. Iran lost its chief of staff to an Israeli strike, appointed a successor specifically meant to rebuild and stabilize the armed forces after that earlier war, and then lost that successor too, in the exact same fashion, within less than a year of taking the job. That's not just a leadership loss, that's a demonstrated, repeated inability to protect the single most senior operational military position in the entire country, twice in a row, against the same adversary using what appears to be a very similar operational playbook both times. Consider how differently this pattern would read if it had happened just once. A single decapitation strike, however devastating, is something almost any government can frame internally as a tragic but survivable shock, a painful but ultimately one-time setback that can be addressed by promoting capable subordinates and moving forward with renewed resolve. What Iran experienced instead was watching that exact same position, the single most senior operational military role in the country, get filled and then eliminated twice within roughly 8 months. That repetition transforms the story from an unfortunate incident into something that looks a lot more like an exposed, ongoing structural vulnerability, one that the regime demonstrably failed to fix, even after having direct, painful personal experience of exactly how that vulnerability gets exploited. Whoever now holds that chief of staff role, or whatever title the position carries going forward, is operating under the weight of that history, fully aware that the position itself appears to function as a kind of standing target that an adversary has already proven twice it can locate and eliminate. And it wasn't only Mousavi's role that suffered this fate. Multiple sources compiling detailed profiles of the commanders killed in this latest strike have noted that many of them were specifically part of a new generation of leadership appointed after that 2025 war precisely to rebuild and stabilize the armed forces following the losses from that earlier conflict. Many of these officers were veterans of the brutal, grinding Iran-Iraq War from the 1980s, men who had spent decades building institutional knowledge and cohesion within the organization, playing a critical role in integrating hard-won wartime experience into Iran's evolving defense structure. Their simultaneous removal, according to analysis published shortly after the strikes, created what's been described as a significant vacuum in the chain of command, leaving the Islamic Republic more vulnerable to future security crises, and potentially impairing its ability to reorganize power at the highest levels of government going forward. In plain terms, Iran had already used up its bench of experienced senior replacements filling the gaps left by the 2025 war, and this latest strike went ahead and eliminated that replacement generation too. There's something almost generational about the specific loss here that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Officers who came up through the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s represented a very particular kind of institutional memory, men who had personally lived through nearly a decade of brutal, grinding conventional conflict against Iraq, who understood in a visceral, first-hand way what sustained warfare actually costs a country and a military, and who had spent the subsequent decades translating those hard lessons into the doctrine, training, and organizational culture of Iran's modern armed forces. That kind of experience isn't something you can simply write down in a manual and hand to the next generation. It lives in the judgment, the instincts, and the informal mentorship relationships that veterans build with the officers coming up underneath them over the course of entire careers. Losing that entire cohort in a single strike doesn't just create an administrative vacancy problem, it severs a direct, living link to the last time Iran fought a sustained, large-scale war, at precisely the moment that kind of hard-won experience would have been most valuable. Let's think about why this pattern of repeated decapitation actually matters so much more than a single devastating strike would on its own. When a military loses senior leadership once, even catastrophically, there's usually still a deeper reservoir of experienced officers a level or two down who can step up, having watched and learned from their former superiors for years, ready to fill the gap with at least some institutional continuity intact. What Iran experienced instead was losing that first tier in 2025, promoting the next tier up to fill those exact same roles, and then losing that promoted tier again less than a year later. Every time you go through that cycle, you're not just losing individual people, you're burning through the institutional depth chart faster than any organization can realistically regenerate it. Think of it like a sports team that loses its starting lineup to injury, promotes its entire practice squad to fill those roles, and then watches that practice squad also get wiped out before the season is even half over. At some point, you're not fielding a team built on experience and depth anymore, you're fielding whoever happens to still be standing, regardless of whether they've had anywhere near the preparation or institutional trust that the roles actually require. Let's talk about the succession question specifically, because losing a supreme leader is categorically different from losing any other position on that list, no matter how senior. Khamenei had held that role for more than 3 decades, serving as Iran's highest authority across every domain: military, political, religious, and strategic. His death didn't just remove one man, it immediately triggered a succession crisis in a system that has never had to manage a sudden, violent transfer of its highest religious and political authority in the modern era of the Islamic Republic. Reports following the strikes indicated that formal elections for a new supreme leader were being planned for later in the year, run through Iran's Assembly of Experts, the body constitutionally responsible for selecting, and in theory, supervising the supreme leader. But holding that kind of formal succession process together, one that's supposed to project unity, continuity, and unquestioned religious legitimacy, becomes enormously harder to manage cleanly when it's happening in the middle of an active war with the rest of the senior security apparatus that would normally help stage manage that transition also freshly eliminated in the same set of strikes. It's worth understanding just how unprecedented this specific situation actually is within the modern history of the Islamic Republic. Since the revolution in 1979, Iran has only ever transitioned its supreme leader role once before, following the death of Ayatollah Khamenei in 1989, and that transition happened under peacetime conditions, with the full apparatus of the state intact and available to manage a careful, deliberate process over an extended period. What Iran is dealing with this time is fundamentally different: a sudden, violent removal of the sitting supreme leader in the opening moments of an active war, alongside the simultaneous elimination of many of the very officials, advisors, and security figures who would normally play a central role in managing exactly this kind of sensitive transition. The Assembly of Experts, tasked with formally selecting a successor, now has to conduct that process, while the broader security environment surrounding it remains in genuine flux, a set of circumstances that has no real precedent in the organization's history and that inevitably invites exactly the kind of internal factional maneuvering and uncertainty that a stable, unchallenged transition is specifically designed to avoid. Now let's get into what actually happens, mechanically, to a military organization when this much senior leadership disappears in this short a window, because it's genuinely one of the more fascinating and consequential aspects of modern command structures. Every layer of a military hierarchy exists partly to make decisions, and partly to translate decisions from higher up into action further down, and partly to serve as an information filter, taking raw intelligence and turning it into something senior leadership can actually act on. When you remove an entire senior tier simultaneously, you don't just lose decision makers, you lose the accumulated relationships, the informal trust networks, and the hard-won judgment about which subordinate commanders can be relied upon in which situations, all of which typically take years to build and simply cannot be transferred instantly to whoever gets promoted into the vacated role. A newly promoted commander might have the correct title and the correct formal authority on paper, but he doesn't automatically inherit the working relationships and earned credibility that made his predecessor's orders actually get followed with confidence and speed rather than hesitation and double-checking. There's also a psychological dimension here that's worth sitting with, because it affects everyone below the level of the officials who were actually killed. Imagine being a mid-level or regional commander somewhere in Iran's security apparatus, watching an entire tier of leadership above you get wiped out in 60 seconds, for the second time in less than a year. That experience fundamentally changes how you think about your own job. You start wondering whether proximity to senior leadership, whether physically or organizationally, is actually a liability rather than a career advantage. You start hesitating before centralizing too much information or too many decisions with any single figure, because that figure might not be there tomorrow. You start distributing risk and authority downward, not necessarily because that's good military doctrine, but because it's a rational survival response to watching leadership repeatedly become the primary target. And that kind of defensive, distributed decision-making, however understandable, tends to produce exactly the kind of slower, less coordinated, more hesitant military response that we've discussed in other parts of this war, where Iran's ability to synchronize complex multi-domain operations has visibly degraded compared to what a fully intact, confident chain of command would normally be capable of producing. Let's talk about the intelligence side of this too, because pulling off a strike this precise, catching 7 senior officials gathered in one place at the exact right moment, isn't something that happens through luck or general surveillance. This level of precision requires deeply penetrated human intelligence, likely sources with direct knowledge of internal scheduling and meeting locations, combined with exceptionally accurate real-time tracking of exactly where senior officials were physically located at the moment the strike was launched. That's a sobering thing for any government to have to reckon with. The knowledge that your adversary's intelligence services have penetrated your own internal command structure deeply enough to know not just where your leadership works, but exactly when and where they'd be gathered together on a given morning. That kind of intelligence penetration doesn't just enable a single devastating strike, it creates a lingering, corrosive paranoia throughout the entire remaining leadership structure. Because if it happened once, with this level of precision, there's no way for anyone left standing to be confident it can't happen again just as easily. Let's move into the roundup section for a moment, because there are a few other threads worth connecting here that tie directly back into the story of this leadership collapse. In the months since these opening strikes, we've talked at length about how domestic insurgencies in Iran's Kurdish and Balak regions have accelerated dramatically, exploiting exactly the kind of centralized authority vacuum that a strike like this one creates. We've also discussed how Iran's broader ability to run coordinated multi-front military operations has visibly degraded compared to earlier in the conflict, with retaliatory strikes increasingly looking like isolated, reactive bursts, rather than part of any sustained, centrally planned campaign. Both of those developments trace directly back to this exact moment, the 60 seconds where Iran's ability to command and coordinate its own military and security apparatus took its single biggest hit of the entire war. When you pull on nearly any thread of dysfunction that's emerged inside Iran's war effort since February, you eventually find your way back to this specific event, as at least part of the underlying cause. There's also the matter of how this event shaped international perceptions of the conflict from the very start. A strike this precise, killing this many senior officials this quickly, sent an unmistakable signal to every government watching this war unfold about the depth of intelligence, penetration, and operational capability being brought to bear against Iran. That signal likely factored into how quickly and how seriously regional actors, from Gulf states to European governments, began recalibrating their own assessments of how this war was likely to unfold, and how much staying power the Iranian regime actually had left once its senior leadership had absorbed a hit this severe right out of the gate. First impressions in a conflict like this one carry enormous weight, and the first impression this war left on the world was that Iran's command structure could be reached, penetrated, and eliminated with a precision most governments assumed was reserved for smaller, less sophisticated adversaries. It's also worth noting how this initial shock likely shaped decision-making inside allied and partner nations throughout the region in the weeks that followed. Countries that had previously calculated their own postures toward Iran based on an assumption of a functioning, centrally coordinated Iranian security apparatus suddenly had to reassess that assumption almost overnight. A regional government weighing how much risk it was willing to accept in cooperating more openly with American or Israeli operations, for instance, would naturally view that calculation very differently once it became clear just how thoroughly Iran's own senior leadership could be reached and eliminated in a matter of seconds. That recalibration among neighboring states, even when it happens quietly and never gets announced publicly, represents another layer of consequence flowing directly out of this single opening strike, reshaping the broader regional balance of confidence and caution well beyond Iran's own borders. Now let's get into the strategic picture, because this is really where the full weight of this event becomes clear. Think about the fundamental purpose of a decapitation strike in military doctrine. It's not simply about killing individual people, however senior. It's about attacking the coordination and decision-making capacity of an entire organization at the exact moment that capacity matters most, right at the opening of a conflict, when speed and coherent strategic direction determine everything that follows. By removing 40 of Iran's most senior commanders in the literal opening seconds of this war, before Tehran's remaining leadership structure had any chance to disperse, adapt its own security posture, or even fully process what was happening, this strike effectively determined the character of the entire conflict that followed. Every subsequent month of this war, every retaliatory strike that's looked more improvised than coordinated, every internal insurgency that's found new room to operate, every rumor of internal factional tension inside the regime, all of it traces back to a leadership structure that never fully recovered from having its most senior, most experienced tier eliminated before the war had even really begun. There's also a broader lesson here about the vulnerability that comes from centralizing too much institutional knowledge in too few hands, especially in an authoritarian system that doesn't naturally encourage distributed decision-making or transparent succession planning. Democracies and more decentralized governing systems tend to have, almost by structural necessity, more redundancy built into their leadership, more officials with genuine independent authority and public legitimacy who can step into a vacuum if something happens to the people above them. Highly centralized systems like Iran's, where enormous amounts of both formal and informal authority concentrate in a small number of trusted, long-serving figures around a single supreme leader, are specifically vulnerable to exactly this kind of single catastrophic event, because so much of what actually makes the system function day to day depends on relationships and trust built up over decades among a relatively small circle of people. Remove that circle all at once, and you're not just removing 40 individuals, you're removing the accumulated social and institutional infrastructure that made the entire regime capable of functioning smoothly in the first place. It's also worth considering what this means for how any future conflict involving a similarly structured government might unfold going forward, because this event has almost certainly become a case study that military planners in multiple countries are studying closely right now. The demonstrated ability to gather this level of precise, real-time intelligence on senior leadership movements, combined with the coordinated strike capability to act on that intelligence within the exact same narrow window across multiple locations simultaneously, represents a meaningful evolution in how modern militaries think about opening moves in a conflict against a centralized, authoritarian adversary. Whether or not any future conflict actually replicates this exact playbook, the fact that it worked this decisively twice in less than a year against the same target has fundamentally changed the calculation every similarly structured government now has to make about how physically dispersed and how operationally unpredictable its own senior leadership's movements and meeting patterns need to be, simply to avoid becoming the next case study in exactly this kind of catastrophic single-strike leadership collapse. There's also an important honesty check worth including here, because it would be an oversimplification to suggest that losing this much senior leadership automatically means a country's entire military effectively stops functioning. Iran has continued to generate real retaliatory strikes throughout this war, continued to inflict genuine casualties on American and allied forces at various points, and continued to maintain enough coordination to keep its remaining ballistic missile and drone capabilities operational to some degree. A country of Iran's size and military scale, with hundreds of thousands of personnel across multiple branches and paramilitary organizations, doesn't simply collapse because its senior command tier gets eliminated, however devastating that loss is. What changes, and what we've seen play out consistently since this opening strike, is the quality and coordination of that continued resistance, not its complete absence. Individual units and even individual commanders can still fight, sometimes effectively, but the kind of sophisticated, multi-domain, precisely synchronized operations that require deep institutional trust and years of working relationships between senior commanders across different branches becomes vastly harder to reproduce once that senior tier has been repeatedly and catastrophically hollowed out. So where does this actually leave things right now? The leadership Iran has in place today, from whoever has been elevated into the role of Supreme Leader through the Assembly of Experts process, down through the newly appointed commanders filling roles across every branch that lost its senior officer in that 60-second window, is operating with a fundamental disadvantage that no amount of formal authority can fully overcome in the short term. A near total absence of the kind of deep institutional trust and battle-tested working relationships that took decades for the previous generation to build, and that took less than a minute to erase. Every month that passes gives this new leadership tier more time to establish its own patterns and its own credibility, but rebuilding that kind of institutional depth under active wartime conditions, with continued strikes, continued domestic unrest, and continued economic collapse all happening simultaneously, is an extraordinarily difficult environment in which to actually succeed at that rebuilding process. Whether Iran's command structure ever fully recovers the coherence it had before February of 2026, or whether this repeated pattern of decapitation has permanently altered the character of how this regime is able to project and coordinate power going forward, might end up being one of the most consequential open questions of this entire conflict. It's also worth stepping back and asking why an event this consequential hasn't received the sustained, ongoing coverage that its scale would seem to warrant. Part of the answer is simply the nature of how a fast-moving war gets covered. A single dramatic opening event tends to get its moment of intense attention, and then gets overtaken by whatever's happening most recently, even when that opening event continues shaping everything that follows for months afterward. Part of the answer is also that the full scope of exactly who was killed, and exactly how devastating the resulting institutional vacuum actually was, only became clear gradually, through detailed reporting and analysis compiled well after the initial headlines had already moved on to other developments. But taken together, the full picture: 40 senior commanders eliminated in 60 seconds, a supreme leader killed alongside his closest advisors, an entire post-2025 war replacement generation of commanders wiped out in the same strike that eliminated the generation before them, represents one of the most consequential single events of this entire conflict, and arguably deserves to be remembered as the moment that shaped everything that came after it, far more than any individual strike or battlefield development since. What do you think happens next? Do you think Iran's new leadership tier eventually rebuilds the kind of coordinated command structure it had before this war started? Or do you think this level of repeated decapitation has done permanent, lasting damage to how this regime is able to function as a coherent military and political entity going forward? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I think this is genuinely one of the most underappreciated turning points of this entire war, and it deserves a lot more attention than the single headline number usually gets. If this breakdown helped you understand just how significant those 60 seconds actually were, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed analysis reach more people, trying to understand what's actually shaping this conflict beneath the surface. Subscribe if you want to keep following how this leadership vacuum continues to play out, because it's still actively shaping nearly everything happening in this war right now. And if you know someone who's been following this conflict but hasn't fully grasped just how devastating and how unprecedented this opening strike actually was, share this with them. Because once you understand what happened in that single minute back in February, so much of what's followed in this war since starts making a whole lot more sense. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.